Thank you, Jorge, Executive Director Fedotov, distinguished delegates. This is the first time I'm speaking here, so I would like to express deep condolences to the family and friends of those who died in the tragic plane crash last week. Corruption is present in the wildlife sector as it is present in other sectors, and in fact in just about any form of human activity. In the case of illegal trade in wildlife, corruption is often an integral component. And the impacts of this corruption are not only felt by people, by our institutions, in terms of our quality of life, but this corruption is driving wild species of plants and animals to extinction, including very well-known and charismatic species such as the elephant and the rhino. CITES is a legally binding international agreement with 181 parties. It regulates international trade in over 35,000 species of wild plants and animals. And under our convention, states are obliged not to trade in wildlife, other than in accordance with the provisions of the convention, to take measures to enforce the convention and to prohibit trade in violation of it, and also to include measures to penalise such trade. Very briefly, how we regulate that trade, basically in two clusters. We have species that are found on what we call Appendix 1, that's about 3% of the species. These plants and animals are already threatened with extinction, and for them there is no commercial trade. This includes specimens such as the ivory of the elephant, rhino horn, great apes, tigers, and marine turtles. For other species, which is in another cluster we call Appendix 2, and this is about 96% of the species, these are species that are not yet threatened with extinction, but they could become threatened if their trade is not strictly regulated. To be sure, the trade is legal, it is sustainable, and it is traceable. And this includes trade in species and specimens such as the skin of a python or of a crocodile, the wool of the vicuña, it's like a llama in Latin America, the meat of the queen conch, and the bark of the African cherry tree. When states do propose to allow trade in Appendix 2 listed species, there are three preconditions. The state has to confirm that the specimen was legally taken. It has to do a scientific finding to say that the level of trade is sustainable, and it has to issue the relevant permits and report them through to the Secretariat, which we make publicly available. The text of the CITES Convention does not specifically mention corruption, but the links between corruption and illegal trade in wildlife have been acknowledged by the parties to CITES over many years and in many different ways, including through a resolution it adopted on compliance and enforcement. And this resolution includes a paragraph that specifically encourages parties to CITES that are not yet parties to the UN Conventions against Transnational Organised Crime and Corruption to consider joining these conventions. Mr. Fedotov has just referred to the UN General Assembly resolution adopted just this year on tackling illicit trafficking in wildlife. It includes a specific provision that calls upon member states to prohibit, prevent, and counter any form of corruption that facilitates illicit trafficking in wildlife and wildlife products. And this groundbreaking resolution also refers to the three primary conventions that are needed to fight this illicit trade, including the related corruption, that is CITES and the UN Conventions against Transnational Organised Crime and Corruption. And Mr. Fedotov has also referred to the Sustainable Development Goals adopted in September. Goal 15 includes specific targets to address illegal trade in wildlife and to bring this poaching and illegal trade to an end. And the target under Goal 16 specifically addresses corruption. And today's event here in the beautiful city of St. Petersburg is the first time in the history of this convention that we've had a high-level event that is convened to specifically address the issue of corruption and how it affects illegal trade in wildlife. And for that, I'd like to express our most sincere gratitude to Executive Director Fedotov. He's been a great champion of this issue since he and I had the first opportunity to meet here in St. Petersburg at the Global Tiger Summit 5 years ago, almost to the day, not quite. But he's been a champion of this cause, and he was the initiator of this event, and we're deeply grateful to you and your team. So then how does corruption manifest itself under CITES? As you would gather, effective implementation of the convention involves the issuance and inspection of permits and certificates where there is to be legal trade, as well as detecting illegal trade that is in the process of moving across international borders. And within the world of CITES, we have witnessed corruption in many different forms, including through the offering, seeking, and acceptance of bribes in a whole manner of different ways, the making of false claims that animals have been captively bred, and the direct involvement of officials in the theft of and trade in wildlife, including, unfortunately, by rangers who have been corrupted and rogue elements of the military. And although the vast majority of officials that are involved in dealing with wildlife trade, be it the legal aspect or the illegal aspect, are honest and hardworking and committed to their task, unfortunately, we are seeing increasing evidence of corruption that is undermining the objectives of the convention and is of increasing concern to us. And we do regulate trade or seek to prevent trade in very high-value products, ivory, rhino horn, etc., and it does make officials vulnerable to attempts to corrupt them. In one recent example, the former wildlife director and head of the CITES Management Authority of Guinea has just been arrested in August of this year for his suspected role in corrupt and fraudulent actions in the issuance of CITES export permits, including as they related to great apes. This is also a case where the national enforcement authorities worked very closely with the non-government sector, and most notably a group known as the Eagle Network. And these non-state actors, these civil society groups, we've seen can play a very important role in the prevention of and fight against corruption as it affects the wildlife sector, including in raising public awareness about the causes and gravity of the threats posed by corruption. And that's something we see is reflected, and the importance of this is reflected in Article 13 of this Convention against corruption. And in the wildlife sector, we do see individuals and groups from outside of the public sector actively participate in the fight against corruption. And the need to legally protect people who report corruption is recognised in Article 3 of the Convention, and that's something that we feel very strongly about as well. Distinguished delegates, organised crime groups involved in illegal trade in wildlife are corrupting officials, they're undermining any attempts to build up the rule of law and good governance, and most importantly, they're also depriving local people of the opportunity to make use of their resources, their wildlife resources, in legitimate ways and in ways that they choose to. So it is denying them to pursue legitimate development opportunities. The impacts of this are deep and multifaceted, and the link between illegal wildlife trade and corruption is inextricable. However, we cannot, as a convention, CITES, a convention of 181 parties, fight this in isolation. We are part of the system, and we must be part of the system, and that's why we're so delighted that we're having an event here where we're bringing this issue into the mainstream of the attempts to combat corruption. International and national anti-corruption laws, institutions, and efforts to address this are all linked to illegal trade in wildlife. Now, the importance of being part of the mainstream was reflected or is reflected in the overall anti-corruption measures on combating illegal wildlife trade is evident from what the Chinese government has been doing with its far-reaching campaign against corruption and how this is impacting the demand for illegally traded ivory. Ivory carvings and ivory tusk, amongst others, have often been used as gifts for bribery in China. And this national anti-corruption campaign is serving to drive down demand for illegally traded ivory. And Executive Director Fedotov have talked about what we've done over the past 5 years to ensure that illegal trade in wildlife is treated as a serious crime as defined under the UN Convention against Transnational Organised Crime. And he's also referred to the Crime Congress Declaration from Doha. All of these go to show the synergies between CITES and the 2 UN conventions dealing with transnational organised crime and corruption. It was here 5 years ago in St. Petersburg that the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime was established, as Executive Director Fedotov said, And the letter of understanding itself identified the need to tackle corruption if we're going to effectively tackle illegal trade in wildlife. And we have, as a consortium, been providing support at a national and regional effort to combat this illegal trade. To finalise, enforcement efforts alone will not be sufficient to end corruption in the wildlife sector. We need to continue to build on and maintain properly paid, trained and equipped civil services, including park rangers, and this requires interaction with a range of other entities and shows how we are linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. And we are pursuing other novel approaches, such as through the growing use of the CITES electronic permitting system and other information technologies. Using electronic permitting makes it more difficult for people to engage in corruption, and it makes it easier for us to detect corrupt practices. And this is something we're continuing to build upon. Distinguished delegates, combating illicit trade in wildlife is inextricably linked to the fight against corruption. And today's event serves to reinforce the synergies between the principal global legal instruments for tackling both issues. And we again extend our sincere thanks to Executive Director Fedotov and his team for bringing us all here together to advance our collective efforts. Thank you. Thank you.